Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. This webinar is about international remote work in Europe within the RemotEU project. It is a project on which we have been working and developing in collaboration with other European entities, Spain and Italy, for a few months. As a result of our research, we have organized this webinar to address the most common questions and discuss teleworking in Europe, particularly considering legal aspects, country differences, and the various modalities being used for remote work. Based on the information gathered, many of you are working for companies located in the same country where you are working remotely. However, it is all possible that others are working for companies in another country. Therefore, in this webinar, we will all consider that possibility and explore how it can be done. First, we will briefly introduce what RemotEU is. Secondly, we will talk about the importance of regulation in Europe regarding teleworking, as well as what should be taken into account once you decide to work or if you are already teleworking. This webinar mainly aims at those who are not yet teleworking but want to and are considering it and like to propose it to their company. Thirdly, we will discuss what must be regarded when suggesting teleworking to the company. Lastly, we will give you two examples of entries and posts from Teleworking Wiki on the project's website to explain what a wiki consists of and how it can help you. Finally, we will end with a brief general conclusion. What is RemotEU? These projects emerged to address the needs of individuals who are interested in teleworking. Each partner involved in the project has their own motivation, but we all share the common goal of providing information and resources for people who want to engage in remote work. Our company, Helping Networks, provides support for entrepreneurs in Ireland and is familiar with the local job market. That's why we decided to be part of this initiative, as we want to contribute our knowledge about telework in Ireland. Ireland is home to some of the largest technology companies in Europe, with many of their headquarters located here. The pandemic forced many workers to start working from home without specific legal regulations, and it was up to the companies to design their own remote work policies. Since late 2022, employees have gradually returned to work from offices. And while hybrid models are being discussed, most large companies are reverting to into office work, with some exceptions for teleworking. On a positive note, the Irish government is determined to incorporate teleworking into legislation integrated into a higher ranking law. The idea for the project arose from the experience of 8 partners regarding teleworking in their respective countries. Once we realized that working on regulation for teleworking in Europe was a good idea, we set the plan in motion. The next step was for our partner in Spain, Volvemos, who has extensive experience in assisting Spanish immigrants in returning to their home country, to present the project to the European Commission as part of the Erasmus Plus call. Once the project was approved, the 3 partners, including us in Ireland, began working on it, and today's webinar is a contribution from us as partners in Ireland to the project. Simultaneously, our partners in Italy and Spain are contributing content to the project's website and promoting the project's content through their communication channels. We have explained the motivation for this project, and now we are going to continue with the phases of the project. We started working on it in February of last year and the three partners have been dedicated to it for over a year. Now we conclude the project in August of this year. In the first research phase, we will focus on analyzing the legislation regarding teleworking in Europe, specifically in Spain, Ireland, and Italy. It is published on the RemotEU website and contains 75 articles with the most important information related to this research work. I encourage you to visit the website and explore it. After that, we move on the current phase. After that, we move on the current phase, which is this webinar discussing teleworking. We have also prepared a quiz, which you will find a direct link to in the presentation. I invite you to participate and try to solve it because it can help us address any question you may have. After all this work, the project will conclude with a final report that will encompass all the research we have conducted. However, it will also include a series of recommendations. I believe that is the greatest value of this project for public administration and entities of all kinds, not only in Ireland, but also for European entities interested in creating and promoting legislations in international teleworking. They can do so and base it on the experience we have gained during these months by observing teleworking both within and outside of Ireland. Working remotely internationally is now a way of working. And while Ireland is currently not a sending country for remote workers, as the government intends to promote teleworking in more sparsely populated areas within Ireland, it is a growing trend in other sending and receiving countries. There is a lack of appropriate legislation to address all the circumstances that arise when teleworking extends beyond the country where the employee company is located. Let's go now to move to the core of this webinar. As we mentioned earlier, this webinar will primarily focus on the existing regulation in Europe and in Ireland, rather than international regulations. We concentrate on European regulations because there is no specific legislation for international teleworking. This lack of clarity creates significant challenge and promoting such practices when there is an unclear ecosystem for both companies and workers. From what we have observed, the motivation to telework comes entirely from the employees who desire and decide to propose it to their employees. In response, companies face a landscape of uncertainty, unsure of what actions to take and what costs are involved. Often this possibility is dismissed, or if considered, there is a constant sense of uncertainty. Therefore, to establish a regulatory framework within Europe, it is important to note that there is no specific legislation in place. In 2002, several years ago, the European Framework Agreement on Teleworking was introduced. This was the first legislation in Europe related to telework. It mentioned 2002 to highlight that it was a regulation designed by European social partners and focused on fundamental aspects of telework, such as occupational safety, data protections, working conditions, etc. However, it does not address the complexity that we see in today's telework situations. There are also other European regulations that are relevant to telework, although they are not specific to telework itself. Here, we are referring the norms and directives related to social security schemes, the movement of workers, the regulations for posted work, etc. However, there is no specific legislation regarding international telework. Therefore, individuals considering remote work or companies allowing telework from another country must first consult these regulations. European legislation on telework is a very basic and not sufficient, but it is what currently exists and must be complied with. There are also other European regulations that are not specific to telework, but are related to it. The specific regulation may vary depending on the type of work. In general, it is important to aware that there are generic rules that must always be followed. We also mentioned two additional regulations in the presentation, such as the Directive on the exercise on conferred rights. Despite their formal sounding nature, all these regulations must be taken into account. In addition to European regulations, individuals and companies intending to engage in telework within their company should be aware of bilateral agreements. These agreements hold significant importance and should always be considered between the sending and receiving countries of the teleworker. A bilateral agreement is a pact between two countries. There are numerous bilateral agreements covering various areas and subjects. In the context of telework, it is important to pay attention to bilateral agreements concerning matters such as social security and tax residence, among others. This topic directly related to work should be addressed in bilateral agreement. This means that if, for example, a person wants to work from Spain for a company based in Ireland or vice versa, the first step is to consult the existing bilateral agreements between Ireland and Spain, as well as any that may not exist. In these cases, depending on the countries involved, there may be no such agreement. In such cases, we return to the legal gray area mentioned earlier. In this case, there is a bilateral agreement between Spain and Ireland, and a new multilateral convention has been approved that modifies the previous agreement. Another important aspect is the specific legislation of each country beyond European regulation. For example, in Spain, one of our project partners, the Law 10/2021 in remote work was published due to the pandemic. This law regulates the functioning of teleworking within Spain. This means that if a person is working within Spain and changes cities within the country, if agreed upon, it should be regulated by the law approved in Spain in 2021. This approved law in Spain regulates the telework within the country. However, the situation will be different if a person that is working right now in Ireland decides to move to Malaga to work. In this case, Spanish legislation will not apply. Finally, we have collective agreements in addition to all the labor, social security, and tax regulations. The specific collective agreement of the worker must also be considered, depending on the professional sector in which the worker is employed. There will be different collective agreements. Ultimately, these agreements also regulate the activities of professionals, so they must be taken into account. The same applies if one intends to work from Ireland, Spain, Italy, or France. Different regulations at different levels must be considered. In the presentation, there is an EU report included at the bottom, which provides information on the different regulations and the countries that have enacted more or few regulations regarding teleworking. This provides an overview of the legislative landscape related to telework. Let's continue with the different telework models. We can find employees working as posted workers for a company located in another country. Also, working as an employee for a company located in another country through a branch of the same company in the territory. Another difference is working as an employee for a company based in another country through an intermediary company named as well as employer of records. Fourth kind of telework model is a self-employing for a company located in another country. And the last option could be is work as a freelance for various companies based in the country and or in a different country. Now we are going to discuss the barriers and opportunities to international teleworking. It is crucial to emphasize, although we have mentioned it before, that there are significant barriers to teleworking that affect all teleworkers regardless of their location. The first barrier is the lack of existing regulation and the unfamiliarity with current legislation. As we mentioned earlier, although there is no specific legislation that regulates international teleworking, the regulation in each country and the European Union, for example, that government telework are more general and not well known in the business and their labor sector. In many cases, when teleworkers approach us, they often say, well, I want to telework and I propose it to my company and they agreed, but it is up to me to figure out how to do it. Except for a few exceptions, companies also have lacked extensive information about the state regulations governing teleworking or have only partial knowledge. On the other hand, individuals generally lack legal expertise and are more focused than the companies, leading to a significant lack of knowledge about how to do things correctly. Additionally, one must consider the cost for the company, the management, and responsiveness capabilities on both the company and the employee, and so on. All these aspects need to be taken into account when considering teleworking. Now let's talk about the opportunities. When we talk about teleworking, we are referring to the benefits it brings to employees, such as achieving a better workplace balance and the freedom to live wherever they want. It also opens up new opportunities for workforce re-entry. However, there are also advantages for companies. For instance, talent retention and the competitiveness of certain companies increase exponentially thanks to the possibility of their employees teleworking from anywhere in the world, or, as in the case of Ireland, being able to work outside major work hubs like Dublin, Cork, Galway, or Limerick. All these aspects need to be taken into consideration. During our research project, the three partners involved have observed, especially in light of the pandemic, the emergence of a broad ecosystem around teleworking. Countless terms related to teleworking, a wealth of information, and so on. This motivates us to develop and provide an accessible tool to everyone. The Teleworking Wikipedia. In this wiki, we have compiled this information in one place to make it easily accessible for you to consult whenever you need it. Let's go to talk about two examples of entries in the wiki to help you understand their content and what they can provide you with regarding teleworking. One of the entries in the wiki is about what a digital nomad is. A digital nomad is a remote worker who uses the internet to carry out their work from anywhere in the world, adopting a nomadic lifestyle that allows them to constantly travel. In my opinion, this is a very broad definition, but I like to bring up this term because, as I mentioned earlier, a digital nomad can be a self-employed worker or an employee. So the initial concept of a freelance is not the only one. In the most cases, we are indeed talking about freelancers, self-employed workers who telework from anywhere in the world, but it can also include employees or salary workers. Within the term digital nomad, there is an aspect that greatly affects them and is crucial to consider because it is a mandatory concept that digital nomads must manage correctly to avoid tax issues. We are referring to tax residency, which is something that is often not initially considered when talking about teleworking. Yet it influences all circumstances surrounding digital nomads or teleworkers. Therefore, I would take this opportunity to explain what tax resident is and how it is determined. Typically, we will think that tax resident within all the 183 days rule that may sound familiar to many. This rule states that if I spend more than 6 months in a country, I am considered a tax resident of that country. While it is one criterion, but it is not the only one, so it is often overlooked. To determine what resident, the location where your family resides can also be considered. For example, if you have children who reside in Ireland while you are working in Spain, the revenue can say, no, your tax resident is in Ireland because that's where your family and children are. This could happen, or it could be based on where your center of economic interest lies. I mean, it is not as simple as saying, no, that's not the case, and then spend more than 6 months in Ireland to regain tax resident here. It could be, but doesn't have to be. Therefore, it is advisable to inquire with the revenue about the criteria for determining the tax resident. What are the implications of tax residence? If you are resident in a country that is where you pay taxes and where you must fulfill your tax obligations. Therefore, the concept of tax resident is significant enough to have a clear understanding, especially when we start teleworking from another country. It is possible to encounter conflicts between two countries where one may say, no, my resident country is France, while the others insist, no, your tax resident is here, and as such, you must pay tax here. As a teleworker, I may not be interested in being in one place or another because it could mean paying more or fewer taxes. That's why it is important to have regulation in place, especially through bilateral agreements. Among the different types of agreements, there is one called a double taxation treaty. In this treaty, each country regulates how to the tax resident of individual is determined. In the case of Ireland and Spain, we mentioned before there is a bilateral agreement between Spain and Ireland that regulate that matter. In principle, each individual is responsible for determining their tax resident and be consistent with it before getting involved in some type of conflict. In Spain, there have been cases of teleworkers who did not declare themselves as staff residents in Spain, and the Spanish tax authorities, depending on how they did or did not handle the procedures, claimed that they had not declared tax residency in recent years, resulting in financial penalties. Now, the other term that we want to talk about is the employer of record. Imagine that you are working in Ireland and you want to go to work to Spain. So you propose to the company work remotely from Spain, and the company say that it is possible, but the condition is that you come to Dublin once a month. The question is, what we do from here? The company does not have a presence in Spain, nor does it intend to have it. This is where employers of records came into play. The employer of record is a necessary agent for a worker who wants to be in another country where his company does not have a presence. What that means? The employer of record does have a branch in that country. So what it does is hire the worker in that country. In the case, if I have proposed my company in Ireland, an employer of record in Spain hires me. I have a Spanish contract. I ended my employment relationship as I had until now with the company in Ireland. The employer on record in Spain is responsible for complying my tax, social security, and labor obligations under the Spanish legislation. Is charged a commission to the company of origin, the company in Ireland, for this work, for the management of the worker. The employer of records do not get involved in the day-to-day operation of the company of the worker. This means that the company will not monitor whether the work is fulfilled their tasks. Using an employer of record help a company and an employee to solve the issue related to different countries and don't have presence from the company. Important aspect to take into account to teleworking is if you are a citizen of the European Union or not, because if you are EU citizen, you have not too much difficult to move inside Europe. The different situation is for non-European citizens that usually they need work visas. It's important to determine that as resident, as we said previously, we need to know the regulation of the country where you reside regarding tax and social security matters, and the regulation of the country regarding remote work. And also we need to take into account the company's regulation. If we are in the point that we need to negotiate with our company or remote work in another country, we need to take into account different aspects for negotiations. The best advice that we can provide you with the experience that we regard with this project is that in all the moment you need to show commitment with the company. You need to approach to the negotiation from an impersonal perspective because you need to get what you want, but the company want the worker that they had previously. If they can feel that the 10-year your country could be a loss for him, let's go to propose to our company that we want to telework. What I have to consider. Firstly, I need to understand that it is a negotiation and should be treated as such. In other words, I have to be aware of the benefits and disadvantages, both for me as an employee and for the company. Here, I'm reiterating things I have already mentioned, such as the cost it will entail for me and for the company, and how important my role is within the company. The more significant or crucial my role is, the better prepared I will be for the negotiation. All of the above is related to talent retention by my company. Additionally, it is also important to consider the company's structures and whether there are already employees teleworking or if there is an existing telework culture. For example, are there already employees teleworking, or is this the first time that it is being proposed to my company? Throughout the entire negotiation process, I must assure the company that my work will not be affected, that I will be able to continue performing my role smoothly, and that daily operation will not be impacted among other things. And one very important thing that we always mention is that in negotiations, we cannot take it personally. In other words, if the company disagrees with something I propose, I cannot receive it as a personal offense. It happens, it's logical, but I have to be more objective and consider what I gain from these negotiations, what I want to achieve, what is my objectives. When you reach that point in the negotiations, we advise you to think about the possible sacrifice you may have to make because you are changing the conductions you have with your company. And it is a personal decision that did not originate from the company. When the company agrees, it is also important to express gratitude for their willingness. With all this in mind, I reiterate that it is important to approach this negotiation considering all these factors. As I mentioned previously and summarizing, we have our Wikipedia. We have the project website called RemotEU.info, where you can find the Wikipedia of teleworking. You already have the link to the quiz, and later on, when we have the webinar and the presentation, we will upload them to the platform just like our partners from Spain and Italy have already done. Therefore, you will be able to access this information and download the document and consult it wherever you want. In conclusion, I have highlighted 3 key points that summarize everything we have discussed. Firstly, telework is a reality that is already present in all countries. We see it everywhere in newspaper, discussion during the pandemic about how telework has become a permanent part of our lives. Or numerous examples of telework in our daily lives. Telework has become a recognized model within the labor market. Many job offers nowadays include telework as an option. Recently, there has been talk of transitioning to a hybrid model, combining remote work with some degree of in-person work. However, the fact remains that telework is here to stay and was already being considered prior to the pandemic, making it undeniable. The second point to highlight is the need for legislation. As I mentioned earlier, there is not a specific international regulation on telework. We always have to refer to respective legislation in each country, if it exists, and then to more general legislation such as European norms that were not specifically created for those circumstances. The third and final important point is that telework arises from an agreement between a company and an employee. So the negotiation mentioned earlier is fundamental for how telework will be implemented. It should be taken very seriously. It is necessary to approach it with as much information as possible and engage in negotiation to reach an agreement. Based on the experience we have gathered from consulting with migrants, this is being done. And the key is to be empathetic, understanding the situation of both the worker and the company, and striving to reach an agreement that benefits both parts under the best possible conditions. And now the last thing to say is thank you all of you to listen this webinar. And I hope that all of you achieve what you want related to your work situation. Anything you can need, you can check more information on the website of this project. Thank you very much and see you soon.